Good evening, everybody. So these people have written amazing books. Several of those books are here tonight for sale, and the authors will all be very happy to sign them for you and maybe schmooze a little with you after the event. So please avail yourself of that. So now I get to talk about this event. And I have to say, this event has been a very long time coming, because when Josh Prager and Ricky O'Patterney and I first put our little dreamer hats on and we thought up this thing, 20 Summers, and we imagined inviting special guests to the barn, each of us immediately started listing our fantasy people that we wanted to have come. And one of my first fantasy people, and we'll say it's also partly because she was local and we were thinking that we could save money on transporting people, but I also really admire her, was Geraldine Brooks, who's sitting in the middle. I had had the privilege of being asked to present her with an honor at the Boston Public Library several years ago, and I read all of her books up to that point in time, and I was so jealous and so amazed and so inspired and thrilled to meet her. And Geraldine, first she said, I just can't do it, I want to come. And then last year, I can't do it, but I really want to come. And finally this year, she said yes. So we were all thrilled. And then I knew I wanted to have her talk with another author, and I had a really fun time thinking of who that other fiction writer might be. And I thought, well, it has to be somebody very worldly. And it has to be somebody who's somebody who's a real woman of the world, and someone who has a breadth of writing talents. And I had the honor of introducing Amy Bloom at an event in Stonington, Connecticut last fall, and I thought, that's it, that's perfect. And I will say also, and we'll see whether they talk about it, that, as you may know, Geraldine Brooks's latest novel is about King David. I cannot imagine summoning that life from the past, but maybe we'll hear something about that. And I happen to know that Amy, who delves somewhat into historically based fiction too, and I hope you're going to forgive me for saying so, is working on a novel currently that will feature Eleanor Roosevelt. And I thought, a king and a first lady, that seems like a really good match. So Amy very kindly said yes. And then they said they would like a moderator. And I thought, well, I want someone who also has a great deal of experience and whose work I really admire. And Gail Mazur came to mind, who I have met off and on through the Fine Arts Work Center here, and then also through the Cambridge, is it the Adult Education Center? The Blacksmith House in Cambridge. So Gail very kindly said yes. And I also just finished Gail's most recent book of poetry, Forbidden City, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I'm very happy to see that it's for sale this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to Gail now. Thank you very much.
So I'm delighted to be here tonight with these two fiction writers whose work I love and who are really quite different from one another, but I can see there's common strategies and common commonalities. For one thing, they both started their careers not as fiction writers. So I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to throw out some questions and let them talk. That's the idea. And then if you all have questions, we will welcome them. I have to read this because there's such profusion in their in their careers. Geraldine Brooks grew up in Australia, and she started her professional career as a journalist, becoming a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in Africa. Her first book of nonfiction was published in 1994, 9 Parts of Desire, based on her experiences among Muslim women in the Middle East. Among her other nonfiction books is Foreign Correspondent, which is a memoir published in 1997. Then, when the 21st century came, something had happened, because she has now 5 novels published since the turn of the century. Year of Wonders, March, People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and The Secret Chord. They're all really wonderful, and there's an enormous range of characters in these historical novels. I mean, people that she's chosen to write about. It's awesome, and I know from the ones who have any autobiographical crossover with me how brilliant her depiction is of place and time and culture. She lives and writes in Martha's Vineyard. One of the things that I found curious was that early in the writing of People of the Book, which is about the set over 7 centuries, 7 or 8 centuries. What's a century? When you got that many. She hadn't quite gotten her main character set, and in the middle of it she had an idea to write the novel called March, which is a totally surprising novel about the father in Little Women, based on Bronson Alcott. And then she went back, and somehow she will maybe tell us how that Geraldine, Amy. Boy. So Amy has 4 books of of short stories and 3 novels. Is that right?
Close enough.
No.
Yes.
Amy lives in Saratoga Springs, right? No. I met her first here, and I love her work. There has been an element of historical novel, but that's not what you think of first when you think of Amy's work. She also began somewhere else, and I'm not sure when she started writing fiction. We'll find out. But she was trained and has practiced as a psychotherapist, and maybe still does. No, I wouldn't think so, because she's written 7 books in the last few years. Well, that was really incompetent. Anyway, they're both great storytellers. And one of the things that I would love them to talk about when I let them talk is what I was really struck by today, just thinking about what they've written, is the enormous empathy a great fiction writer has to have for her characters. And I wondered if you could talk about falling in love with your character and when that happens. And I'm sure it doesn't happen in the same time in the process every time, but I was very aware of that just thinking about your books today. Now, if that's a bad question, I'll go to another one.
Oh, it's not a bad question. I bet we've both heard much worse questions.
Right.
That's not a bad question.
Let me see if I can find a worse one.
No, as somebody who started out life as a reporter, I have to say there is no such thing as a bad question or a dumb question, or questions, if they occur to you, that's all the validity they need to be asked, because if it occurred to you, then somebody else is wondering the exact same thing. So.
That's true. You want me to go first?
Yeah.
You're looking at me. Okay. I don't know that. I don't think, for me, I don't have to like my character, but it's not just that I have to love them in some way, but I also have to be them in some way. I mean, I have to see what they see. I never understood. I didn't take writing classes, and I didn't, period. I didn't take writing classes. And so when I first encountered that expression, show, don't tell, I would just go back to it constantly and go, what does that mean? Like, But, and what I understood is that it didn't mean this, describe this over here. It meant to me, be this, show this, don't tell them about it. And to me, there is some kind of level of empathy. Sometimes I think of it as just sort of like astral projection. You have to sort of enter the soul of this other person. And, you know, they're all pieces of me. I remember in one novel, I have a high school teacher, a middle-aged man who falls in love with this 14-year-old girl. And I have to say, also generated some of the first hate mail of my life, in which people were like, how can you write this apologia for this terrible person? And I thought, I understand what it is to look at somebody beautiful and very young and very fresh and sort of, if nothing else, go, you know, how would I not understand that? And you know, and so I always say, you know, when I do teach now, I say, you know, you don't have to have embezzled $2 million to understand somebody who embezzled $2 million. You only have to have stolen a candy bar when you were 8 years old. And remember the anxiety and the planning and the shame and the thrill. And if you're willing to write about that and re-experience that, you can be there. So sometimes I love my characters, but I always, I think, experience, especially the ones that are more central to the story, as, I guess, other selves in some ways. I mean, you got to be able to see them so you're not blinded with love. But for me, I also have to be able to be them.
When you were a practicing psychotherapist, could you work with a patient that you didn't like?
I hate answering these questions in front of people who have undoubtedly been in psychotherapy. Let's see.
You know who you are.
We all know who we are.
We
think
all have lately.
It's harder, and I mean, really, the job, it seems to me, if you're doing this for a living, you know, and not just, you know, I don't know, hanging out and being nice, then is for me to understand what it is that I don't like, what it is that is distressing to me or irritating to me or disturbing to me, and to see if there's some opening there through which I can, you know, it's like you sort of put your hand into this tunnel and you pull whatever is inside out if you can, so you can see it differently. I guess in my professional life, if I felt that I could not get anywhere else with somebody, I would eventually, it didn't happen very often, I think it happened twice in 20 years, suggest that they see somebody who I thought would be, as I would have put it then, more competent than I was. So, you know, people who are unlikable are, you know, not unlikable by accident.
Well, I don't see in either of your cases sort of characters with negative qualities who are somehow caricatured and less understood than the characters that you love. That's I guess why I asked the psychotherapy question, which was.
For me, it's not, I love how Amy puts it, of entering another's soul, but for me, it's getting somebody to be willing to rise up out of the grave and speak to me. And I really need to hear their voice. And until I can hear a voice, I really can't start, because I like to write with a first-person narrator about 90% of the time. And so it's, I spend a lot of time walking around graveyards on Martha's Vineyard, you know, just to get that kind of connection with the dead, and also there are really good names there that you can pillage. And you see sometimes some really wonderful and moving inscriptions on the grave. My favorite one on Martha's Vineyard, in a lighthearted vein, is a more recent one, and it says, "At last a year-round resident." And then there's a really beautiful one, and it's a sort of a pillar, and it has a Jewish star on one side, and a cross on the other side, and then two men's names, and it says, "Since 1950." And I thought, the struggle that it must have been to have this love all that time, and this is, so wonderful that their families have recognized this and left this wonderful monument to their love and acceptance. And I'm just completely so lifted up by this monument. And I wrote about it, and I get this phone call, and it's one of the names of the guy on the gravestone. And he and his partner put that there because they didn't trust their families to do the right.
And they didn't die.
They're not dead yet. Anyway, so I'm often trying to hear the voices of people who were the unheard in the past, people who weren't allowed to become literate, who didn't leave us their carefully crafted pensées about what it was like to be them. So if you're writing about Caleb Cheshire-Tearmark, who's the first Native American graduate of Harvard in 1665, it would be so wonderful if he had kept a journal and we knew what his struggles were, what his life was. And I keep hoping somebody will find such a thing in an attic in Cambridge, but so far not. So you have maybe two pieces of writing from his hand from which to try and extrapolate a voice, or women, an illiterate shepherd and lead miner's wife in 1665 in the Peak District. So where do you find those voices to hear them? And interestingly, you often find them in court documents where they took verbatim testimony, and that's where the illiterate enslaved people, or here in New England, women in the church courts, and they would take down exactly what they said. And often what they said was full of insight and anger about their oppression. And so I've had a lot of critics say, oh yes, well her female characters are way too feminist. And I'm like, go and read some 17th century court documents. We are not the first women to understand that we were getting a bum deal here, so. And I do love many of them, and some of them irritate me to death. Writing Mr. March was the opposite. I didn't have to struggle to hear his voice because that guy he had an extensive correspondence. He kept a journal every day of his life. It was the most perfect archive of a Victorian idealist sensibility that you could wish for.
And the culture, the Boston culture of the time.
Yes,
too.
everybody wrote about him. Yeah.
And he was impossible.
Well,
I mean, to people.
That's the voice of the writer.
Right.
No, I think
he's not in March.
I think people want to put him, they want to put him under the harsh light of a modern sensibility, but for a man of his time, I think he was remarkable. So.
I call that falling in love.
Well, I wouldn't want to be married to him, that's for sure.
Right. So, do you want to talk at all about writing practices? Would you? I'm sure people would be interested.
Well, sure. My writing practices, I assume, are the kinds of things that make other people feel better about themselves. My writing practices are just horrible. I used to think that it was because of my terrible children. But then, they left home, and it turns out it had nothing to do with them. I'm just a procrastinator. And I get up, I do stuff. if I have nonfiction to write, I write nonfiction. I answer emails. If I'm lucky, one of those terrible children calls me and, you know, in the manner of children calling home, tell you an incredibly long and detailed story about people you don't know and events that you weren't present for, but it takes a long time, so that's great. And then I can have another cup of coffee. Sometimes I walk down the driveway and get the mail. Sometimes I go earlier than the mail actually comes, so I can take like an extra little walk to get the mail. And then I wish I started early. This is what I would like to do. I would like to be the kind of person who gets up, shuffles to my desk in my pajamas, as some of my friends do, and just bangs it out. I have never done that in my life. I look forward to that. And so sometime around lunchtime, you know, you gotta have a yogurt or something, and you gotta make a sandwich or something, or think about how come you don't have any yogurt and you don't have any sandwiches and what's wrong with you and how do other people manage these difficult things. And so then I get to it in the early afternoon, and then I write until my eyes cross, basically. I have tried sometimes to have a different kind of writing practice, because I feel like in comparison to other people who write books about writing practices and being writers, I feel like the only reason anybody would buy my book would be just to brighten their own day. Just to think to themselves, well, it's not like her writing practice, it's not that bad. And that's my writing practice.
No banker's hours. Not banker's hours.
No, and it's you know.
And it's interesting because I think of that as a poet's writing practice. It's really, you know, procrastination and then push and pull. And maybe the whole day doesn't even, you don't get to your desk.
Week. Oh, I can't. No, I know, and you can see I'm still like making all these little terrible faces about it. It's not like I've just started, and it is still that way. It is still push and pull, and then you have a great day, and that's wonderful. A great day for me is 2 pages I don't have to change, that are the way they should be. That's great. I'm a slow writer. How about you?
It's a little different for me because I was 10 years a newspaper reporter, and you don't get to procrastinate. So whatever the circumstances, by the end of the day, you have to have produced something. And, you know, I was blessed with, you know, editors for whom crusty is not even, I mean, these guys were like a week-old baguette. And one of them, the news editor on the paper in Sydney, where I started out as a cub reporter, my first big story, it was so, you know, emotional for me. It was about a mine disaster. I really wanted to do justice to these people. And I'm typing, and he is pacing behind me because it's going to go on the front page. And he says, "Where is the copy?" And I am trying to end it eloquently. And he says, "End it? End it? I will end it." And he leans over and he hits E-N-D and pulls the and takes it away. And that was my training as a writer. And it went on for 10 years, and you're in Kurdistan, and you're writing with a pencil on a piece of paper with a candlestick because there is no power, and you just shared the same towel with 12 peshmerga, and you just have to get it out because telling your foreign editor that the muse is unarriving is not going to be working for him. So I guess when I turned to fiction, I was in a state of abject terror. I turned to fiction because I had a baby at 40, and suddenly I realized that it wasn't going to work to go off on long open-ended assignments to dangerous places while breastfeeding. And I needed a new gig, and there was this story that had been banging around in my imagination for 10 years about this village in England when bubonic plague came, and they took this unique decision to quarantine themselves rather than flee and spread infection. And I'd been thinking about it ever since we stumbled in there on a hiking vacation. And I thought, what was it like to be them? And I sat down to do it, and I had a very limited amount of babysitting, and it had to be done. And so I just worked like a journalist, and it's since been described to me very eloquently by the sculptor Sarah Z, who was asked about her process. And she said, my process? Mess, 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 art. And you hope it's art. That's
So when you're in that situation, when your children are very young, all of those books took a lot of research. Were you able to do most of that from your computer?
No, I don't actually
so.
believe in that either. I think even if you're dealing with something that happened a very long time ago, it is absolutely essential to go there, because just the way the things that don't change, like the way the light falls on the hills of Moab is the same light that David saw. So I owe it to the reader to at least get that right, so you have to go. So I schlepped my kids, and as they got older, I exploited them as research assistants. And they're great, they're fantastic because they're not jaded. They ask questions, they see things that you miss. So yeah, no, I've exploited both of them ruthlessly.
But I wonder if the research part is less procrastination provoking than the writing part. I mean, because you make the plan and you have to go.
Well, it's a lot of fun, I have to say. I love the research. Right. I don't not love the writing either. I know it's kind of outside of the Authors Guild's boundaries to say that you can actually enjoy it, but sometimes when it's going well, it's just the most ecstatic experience.
I think it's forgivable, yeah.
I mean, if you've got 3 days in the Peak District and you have to get everything you possibly get, and then you're going to run out of budget, then you will get it done, yeah.
Amy, when you did your book called Normal, about transgender, that's what the subtitle isn't in front of me.
I know the book.
Yeah, I know. If you just give the subtitle,
it's called, it's been a while. I think that, let's see, Normal.
Hermaphrodite?
Well, that's the end of it. It's cross-dressing CEOs. No, it's Transsexual CEOs, Cross-Dressing Conservatives, and Hermaphrodites With Attitude, which is what the organization, which is now ISNO, it's Intersex Society of North America, what they used to call themselves when they were first just a tiny, tiny organization that had a newsletter. It was called Hermaphrodites With Attitude. Researching the past, as you know, as a journalist, is different than researching the present. And it was really interesting to me. My folks were both journalists, and one of the things I always felt was that I had no interest in being a writer growing up, but one of the things that was a great help to me later on was that it was a job. It was like being a good plumber. I mean, it was a job. You showed up, you did your job. If you had a byline, it meant that you were able to pay your rent. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't like a capital W. It was work. And when I did this book of essays, it was just interesting to me because I didn't feel that I had any special claim on the subject. I was an outsider to all the groups that let me in, and I still remember the tremendous generosity, and I would work with people on their pseudonyms when they felt strongly about it, because for lots of people they already had pseudonyms, and so they needed further pseudonyms to not reveal who they were. And
excuse me, this was what year? This was early in the...
Yeah, this was a while ago. This must have been, maybe 2000. And it was fascinating to me. I remember actually, because Random House is my publisher, and I remember the editor-in-chief saying, I find this stuff fascinating. Everybody will buy this book. And I said to him, which is possibly not my strong point as a negotiator. I said, no, they won't. I said, people are not going to buy this book because it makes people uncomfortable, because it's not just sort of a passing image or a glamorous shot. It's that people are complicated and their lives are complicated, and the things that they have to say are difficult and sometimes painful, and not that many people really want to wade around in that pool. I was right. And the book gets read a lot in universities, in biology classes and sociology classes, and I think, and by people who are interested in the subject. But I think for me, there were two things I remember really vividly. One was that I was on a cruise, and the organizing group was a group that described themselves as family values cross-dressers, and actually they also used to come to Provincetown periodically for Fantasia Fair and other occasions years ago, and it was so interesting to me because we were sort of this small group within the cruise, and we had sort of a section of the dining room, and there were all these different strands. And I remember working so hard, in some sense, to be a good journalist and sort of to keep track of all the different strands as they were coming together, because these were all of the cross-dressers were men. Many of them were there with their wives, and I remembered two things. I remember interviewing one of the women, and I sort of asked how these changes had occurred in their life, and that he had been the captain of the football team, she had been the head of the cheerleaders, they had been together, and about 15 years into the marriage, he had revealed to her that he was a cross-dresser, sort of inadvertently revealed to her, and I asked her how things were different, and I remember this very Midwestern lady saying to me, for 20 years he didn't help me with the dishes because he was watching football. Now he doesn't help me because he's doing his nails. And she said, so how's that different for me? The opportunity to have these long conversations with people, to also sort of experience myself on the cruise, as very much an outsider. I remember staring at myself in the mirror before I went to this dinner. That was our group, and thinking about my appearance in ways that I didn't usually think about my appearance. Like, did I want to emphasize my genetic femaleness? Was that rude? Did I want to de-emphasize my genetic femaleness? But sort of thinking about myself in all of these different terms, because of the experiences that I knew, the men and the women that I was working with or discussing things with and thinking about, and it was great. I mean, the book was, I think, probably a little early, but really interesting. It was a really interesting opportunity for me to think about things and write about them.
And it was early, but it was right at the beginning of what was going to be enormous attention, so it was really an important book.
Well, and probably essential to people who hadn't seen their experiences validated.
Well, people, lots of people in different communities did talk to me. I mean, some of the people were just extraordinary. The woman Cheryl Chase, who was the head of what became the Intersex Society of North America, this is a woman who had started out as mostly a political activist and picketing things like AMA meetings and American Pediatric Association meetings to sort of say the way we're approaching these issues when babies are born and there's some ambiguity about the genitalia is crazy, and we need to stop doing that. And she'd be out there, this was a little thing, literally with a picket sign, sort of marching up and down, and within 6 years, she was a keynote speaker at those organizations. And she had done all this. She was a real queen of the internet, because when I first discovered her website, it had such depth and such range, and I thought, I'm going to be going to this multi-story building and meeting all of the staff. I go, and there is Cheryl in her t-shirt and her sweatpants, and I said, should we go to your office? And she was like, here you go, it's right next to the kitchen. And she had done all of this by herself. thought it was an extraordinary accomplishment to actually change the nature of the conversation and to get people talking in different ways. No, I really liked doing all of that book, and I feel that it was nice for me that it was gratifying. There was, I should mention this, one other couple who were actually heads of one of the cross-dressing organizations in the South, and lovely people, and very funny. Also, they were both Republicans, and I remember staying at their house in Dallas, and I came down to their incredibly yellow and sunny kitchen, and I had stayed over in their incredibly yellow and sunny guest room. And as I came down into the kitchen, the wife said to the husband, she said, "I don't know if Amy's going to be comfortable with this. We should have taken down the pictures of the Bushes and the Reagans." And her husband said, "I think she's a real liberal. She won't mind." And when the book came out, they wrote to me and they said, "You're going to get a lot of shit from a lot of people. And we want you to know that we thought you represented us fairly. And the only thing we would have had you change," they said, "we were a little sorry to see both of us described as statuesque," which is another word for chubby. And it made me very happy that they felt that that book had been
That's great.
a good voice for them.
That's great. I have one more question that's kind of a potboiler. Elizabeth Bishop had this wonderful story called In Prison, which I think is about every writer's fantasy. The character is sentenced to life in prison, and all he can do is read. And it's awful, you know. And I always think that that's a sort of fantasy that particularly writers have. It's just have nothing else bothering them and be alone. So if you were sentenced to solitary confinement, and just to help you think about it, you could escape every once in a while and replenish your little stock of books, what authors do you think you would like to take with you?
Well,
You go first.
I would take poetry. I don't want to pull the old foreign correspondent shtick too hard here, but I actually was in prison for 3 days, but I didn't know how long it was going to be. So I was thinking about these things in real time. And I'm in Nigeria, and in the unlovely city of Port Harcourt. If you ever get a chance to go there, don't. I was writing about Shell Oil and its absolutely egregious complicity with the brutal military dictatorship of Sani Abacha. Anyway, they arrested me, and I didn't know how long they were going to keep me, and I was thinking about all the reporters I knew who'd spent multiple years chained to radiators and in dungeons and whatnot, and I thought, what have I got? What have I got? Where are my resources? And thank God I had this grandmother who said to me, learn poems by heart, because once you've got that, nobody can take it away from you. And I went through all the poetry I knew and all the Shakespeare speeches that my mother had bet me I couldn't learn. And if there's one way to get a kid to learn something, it's to bet they can't learn it. She was very clever. So I would take the Norton Anthology of Poetry and the complete works of William Shakespeare, and that would probably get me a fair way.
It would get you a fair way. Really good answer. Did you all hear that?
Well, now you know why Gail picked the two of us. I would choose poetry too. It's, well, partially, there might be a couple of other books in there, but I would mostly choose poetry because of the way it sort of, pulls you in, but also opens out, and there's all that space and there's all that room for you to, I always assume that the reason they have such big margins is so that you can sort of insert yourself into the edges in some way. And I can't write a word, a line of poetry, but I am a great appreciator, and I think I would I would bring Shakespeare. I would probably bring Szymborska. I wouldn't hesitate to bring you. I think, and I would also probably bring Robertson Davies' The Deptford Trilogy, which is, first of all, a big, fat book, and sort of filled with incident and character, and you know, interesting asides, and also the second volume is not something you're going to see every day, because it's a novel about a Jungian analysis, of which there are very few for good reason, and it kind of covers the waterfront. So yeah, poetry and the Deptford Trilogy.
I remember Maxine Kumin telling me that she went, is it an MRI that you have when it's a brain scan?
Yes.
That she had memorized poetry, and that, you know, it's also a noisy procedure.
Yes, it's not, yeah.
And that she had, I forget what the poem was, but that she had recited the whole thing to herself, and I thought, I got to get on that.
Right, right, on that
before
memorizing.
I get too old, you know.
It's never too soon to start. And another, you know, you asked earlier about process. That is my one little ritual of the morning. Is the school bus comes and takes my younger kid away, and I make the fresh cup of coffee, and I get the knot, and I let it fall open, as some people do with their Bible. But for me, it's the poem of the day, and whatever it falls open at, I read that one. And that's my pump primer. And like you, I would not know how to start to write a poem, but the athleticism with which your people approach language is very inspiring and freeing, and it gets me going.
I try so hard to make students realize that it's almost impossible to write poetry without reading poetry, because it does sort of do something to you when you're empty.
Yeah, it does.
Which you often are in the morning.
Yeah, at the moment, next to my desk is Donald Hall's Without, and Jane Hirschfeld's The Beauty, because they've just, you know, they've sort of wound up there, and I feel the way Geraldine does, that there's some way in which, as long as it's good poetry, it's going to be useful.
I mean, yeah, that's nice. That's nice. Can we take questions from all of you?
We're right here.
Can I just start by, I'd love to hear each of you talk about your most recent book. I really would love to hear something about how you had the chutzpah to bring David out of the grave. And I read an amazing piece that you wrote in the New York Times Magazine about having to write about, there's a bride price involved that I think involves a certain number of foreskins that he had to present in order to win this bride, and how that in itself was a challenge as a fiction writer. How do you write about that? And I don't know whether you want to talk about Lucky Us, which is an amazing story, or maybe you'd give us a peek of how you had the chutzpah to write about Eleanor Roosevelt's secret life. And I'd love to hear about Forbidden City too, so I'm being a bit of a hog, but we could go.
Oh. Well, you know, I didn't start out to write it as a book. I seem to be poem by poem, although I always think the next time I'll start out to write a book. But that book was written, all of it, after my husband died 7 years ago. And I realized as I started to write those poems, a lot of which are about that I wanted really to bring all the richness of a life into the poems, that grief wasn't that simple, and I'm not that simple, and I also am antic and desperate and, you know, sardonic and sentimental and all those things. So those poems sort of unfolded, and I actually, you know, I think that book was written faster than any of my previous books, because even though my writing practices are much worse than Amy's, really much worse, because you didn't put the Times and the Boston Globe in there in your morning.
I didn't.
Right. And then it's lunchtime.
I hear you.
And we have to listen to Dan.
Right. And my exercises. I need to get the world in that book. You know, I didn't want it to be a suffocating book. I didn't want self-pity. I couldn't say I wanted it to be a celebration, but poem by poem, I sort of realized I needed this. Like, I needed the Edenic poem about our early summers in Mashpee, you know, when nothing bad had happened yet, and we didn't think, and we were so young, we didn't think anything ever would. And I needed poems about art. My husband was an artist. And so I had written this short poem about the artist Philip Guston, which was really just about something he said to Mike walking down the street, which was, everything has a form, even doubt has a form. And it was like a koan that I just, this happened 25 years ago. I had never even written it down. It was just something that I could never forget. And then they walked a little further. But Guston was teaching at BU at that point, down Com Ave. And Guston pointed to a truck that was red and blue, I think, and said, "Look at that. Look at that." And the two things were in the same conversation. And then I had a poem about Alan Dugan and our writers' meetings at the Fine Arts Work Center, which was sort of he was very cantankerous and had a, so it was sort of partly funny but also earnest about how incredibly earnest we all were, 8 of us in a room reading 310 manuscripts every year, about how important it was that we have the best writers getting these fellowships, and that nobody's prejudices should be involved. So I realized that it was really important to this book to do that to have Chinese art and Japanese art and poets and writers and artists in the book. And the last poem I wrote for it was a poem about a poem of Jane Cooper's. And then I thought, the book is done. The book is done, that I had sort of managed not to just be weeping on the page for 70 pages.
How did I have the chutzpah to take on King David? There were many days I lay staring at the ceiling, wondering the same thing myself. The idea, the genesis of the idea is easy to talk about. When he was 8 years old, my son said he wanted to play the classical harp, and I thought that was an eccentric choice for a small boy, but being the good Jewish mother, any musical instrument is good, and I was braced for drums or electric guitar, so we looked in the phone book for classical harp and found a teacher. And
on the Vineyard?
No, we were in Cambridge, where you can't spit without hitting a professional musician, so it was easier there. But later on, we were very lucky that the one harpist who could have taught him on the Vineyard actually agreed to do so that was fantastic. But just looking at him in those early lessons, when I would take him to Alston and he would play his teacher's magnificent large concert instrument, and he was really tiny, and it got me thinking about that other boy harpist. And I had been a fine art scholar as an undergraduate, and I particularly loved all the artistic images of David, and they're so diverse. And I started thinking about him and little I really knew about the story. You know, I knew the greatest hits, the adultery, the slingshot, but I started actually reading the book of Samuel, and I realized the most wondrous thing, that everything happens to this guy. Every single thing that could befall a human being, all the greatest highs of human experience and the worst lows you can imagine. And it's a life told from early childhood to extreme old age. And I went and did a little research, and it's really the first political biography we have. And it predates Herodotus by half a millennium. And I was a done deal. I had to do it then. And so I realized that I knew how to do it when I found two lines, I think in Kings and Chronicles, that refer to the lost book of Nathan. And Nathan is the guy who doesn't turn up too much in the story, but when he does, he's the prophet, whatever that meant in Second Iron Age Israel. The prophet who his job in the story is basically to tell the king he sucks. And I was like, what is the career path for that guy? And I knew he was going to be the voice of the novel. And as you know, who know your Bible, there is no book of Nathan. It's lost to us. But it says in Chronicles and Kings that the acts of David from first to last are written in the words of Nathan the prophet. So I thought, what kind of book would this ruthless truth teller have told? And if we had it, what would we know about David that's different to what we do know?
Until the novel I'm working on now, I never wrote about real people. There's this line from Marianne Moore in which she says, you know, my job is to put imaginary toads in real gardens. And I thought, oh, I guess that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be toting real toads in imaginary gardens. So all of my characters in the short stories and in my novels were people I made up and thought up or dug up. And this novel had really, I had been interested in Eleanor Roosevelt, but not passionately interested. I think it's in some ways sort of like Geraldine's story too, in the sense that, you know it when you come upon it, that the subject, it makes sense to me that it's, you know, your son and the harp and the other boy and the harp, and then that leads you to Nathan and the novel. And for me, I think there were a couple of things that prompted me to get to work on the Eleanor and Lorena book, one of which is my strong belief that, especially in the relatively modern world, that people being in the closet and not being able to express their love for another person is a terrible thing, is a cancer. It just destroys people's lives and it destroys their souls. And that was part of what I wanted to write about. I also have, not surprisingly, a real soft spot for middle-aged lovers, for people who don't come from the very beginning, before the bad things happen, but people who come together after the bad things have started to happen, often, very often, in the middle of the bad things that are happening, and that continue to unfold in, you know, the merry way of the universe. And I think I was so touched by this sort of secret relationship, and also a little bit by, like you were discovering Nathan, for me, the fact that Lorena was this very prominent journalist who gives up her career and lives in the White House. It's not like near Eleanor, but in fact is in the room next to Eleanor for several years, and is sort of trying to write about the experience, but also taking herself out of the picture. And I just, her voice became very clear to me in the same way that you, and that's really sort of how I dug up her character, because she is the narrator.
Lorena is the narrator.
Lorena is the
That's
narrator. And she was a journalist, and she was a very good journalist. She was responsible for a lot of the big reports during the Depression on what was actually happening in people's lives in the Dust Bowl, in the South, in the Northwest, and interviewing families and people and writing these very powerful, sort of very Steinbeck-like descriptive passages. She was an excellent writer. And so I could just see them. And for me, for a long time, I feel like Geraldine does, if I cannot hear that character, I can't write the book. It's just dead until that character's voice actually comes through. And I felt that way about her for a long time. I just, you sort of wander around, you're looking for them. And I remember years ago reading an interview with Alice Walker in which she said, "Oh, when I'm writing, my characters come and sit on the end of my bed and tell me things." And I thought, really? Because, in my house, when people come and sit on the end of my bed, they say things like, "Is there any Pepto-Bismol?" They do not reveal the inner lives of my characters, and which was frustrating. But it wasn't just in their letters, although there are 3,000 letters between these two women, and which is even more astonishing when you realize that the more personal and more intimate ones were burned. And so you're like, and it's a lot of letters, and a lot of the back and forth. I just, it turned out that right after FDR died, and after these women were no longer lovers, and they were good friends, but they had lots of ups and downs and lots of loss between them, the person that Eleanor called to be with her right after she moves out of the White House, which she manages to do, by the way, in 12 days. Having lived there for 12 years, she has the entire White House packed up, done, and she's out, hands the key to Bess Truman, is like, "Good luck," and she's gone. And the person she calls is Lorena. And so that weekend that they spend together after all those years apart became the center of the novel.
Mm. Wow, can't wait for
wait.
it. Get cracking.
I gotta go.
Other questions? No curiosity there?
When's the book coming out?
Oh, bless your heart. Yes, you are not the only person who wants to know that. God willing, I'm turning it in February, and so sometime in 2017 it'll come out.
Yeah.
I'm curious, can both of you talk a little bit about your relationship with your editors?
Can both of you talk about your relationship with your editors? We're supposed to repeat the questions.
Yes, our relationship with our editors. There's my official editor, and he is a splendid fellow, and very diligent and craftsmanlike. But I also have my 3 editors that I rely on before anything gets anywhere near him. And I'm very lucky. One of them has to do it because he's married to me. And that's Tony Horwitz. And we're each other's editor of first and last resort. We bounce ideas off each other, and then we are the first reader for each other's work. And then I have a friend in Australia who is from the film industry, and he has a wonderful way of reading that's very different, very visual and very structural. And he often gives me some of my very best suggestions. And then the other one is my mother-in-law, who's just a wonderful line editor, copy editor, grammarian, perfectionist.
Is she actually an editor?
No, well, she has been, but she's just one of these astonishing women of her era who did so many different things. Because you did in those days, you basically were in charge of looking after the family for your neurosurgeon husband, but you also managed to sculpt a gargoyle for the National Cathedral and edit the American Association of University Women publication and everything else that you do.
My mother-in-law didn't do those things. She was just scorched earth. Any other questions?
Can we hear about Amy's relationship?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
I've been with the same editor for a long time, and I will sometimes send a section to one or two writing friends, or if I'm sort of I might send a page, a couple, literally like 2 pages, to my younger daughter, who's also a novelist, which is it's not unlike having my own eyes on my own work, but also her own sensibility, and she's a terrific reader. But I don't really show my work to anybody else, and when it gets to my editor, it's usually pretty clean copy. I do a lot of my own editing, and I love my editor because her role really is she's the captain of the ship for the book, and she's often very good on sort of a structural thing, and then you get the copy editor, the publishing house. But I feel like I learn. I'm a tremendous reviser, and I feel like I learn by rewriting. And you change the word, you change the sentence, you change the sentence, you change the paragraph, you change the paragraph, you change the page, and that for me is a really valuable process. My husband loves me, and he's an architect, and I don't see him as, he will read, he'll like wander in and say, oh, is there anything lying around, and that's fine, but I wouldn't, he gets to see it before it's between hard covers, but he doesn't get to see it when it's still a distressing pile of mess, before it becomes art, right in that middle pile of mess, so.
So the question is, she's struck by the sense of humor they both have, and when they were children, were they funny?
My mum died 2 years ago, and that's not very funny. But she had Alzheimer's for 10 years, and that was really hard because she was always the wittiest person I knew, and she would get the joke, and she would explain the joke. And when I was a little kid, she would make sure I understood the joke. She would take it apart into its components so that I understood the joke. And also, she had the wonderful facility to laugh entirely inappropriately. And so now whenever I am trying to be in the corpse pose at yoga, I think about my mother and I crack up. Or if somebody's giving a pompous speech, my mother is there and her thin little shoulders are shaking, convulsed with laughter about the absurdity of the situation. So yeah, my mother and I spent a tremendous amount of time with cranky Irish priests giving us dirty looks in Mass because we were laughing too hard. So yeah, laughter was a very big part of my childhood, thanks to my mother.
I grew up in a family in which I would describe this as a small group. My father used to say we could have a family reunion in a phone booth. When my grandparents came over, they left lots of family behind in Russia, and everybody they left behind died. So we get here to this little group of people who I think of as sort of not pessimists necessarily, but a little on the dark side, but also very funny, and And for me, it was more like one of those, visions you have of all these sort of ancient stand-up comics sitting around, and they've been together so long, all they have to do is call out the number of the joke, and it was really that kind of family. People would be like, oh yeah, tomato, and people would just like fall down. I had a great appreciation of it, and it was, I remember my grandfather, to whom I was very, very close after he died, as my father's father, and my grandfather had left a diary, which my dad had translated for me and my sister. And it begins, "It's no fun being the youngest son of the poorest man in the shittiest village in Russia." I feel like that's what formed my sense of humor. My sense of humor was formed by people telling jokes over people having their last gasps, my dad actually then describing my grandfather's death to some. My grandfather lived quite a long time, and my father finishing up the story of my grandfather's demise by saying, "So clearly, no foul play." So those are my people.
Yeah.
I'm terribly curious about writing about David and writing about Eleanor. How much time did you spend researching those characters versus creating your own story?
How much time did you spend researching your characters versus creating the story?
David, there are so many scholarly works. First of all, there was a forensic reading of the Bible necessary to extract every single mention. And then I went looking for the vast body of material evidence of David's existence and found that there is practically bupkis. There is, there's no other written record outside of the pages of the Bible. There is one stone inscription that may not refer to the house of David. And apart from that, zero, de nada, nothing. And that was, whoops. And I had never actually written anything where there wasn't a wealth of, if not from, the character that I'm trying to create, somebody very like them. And so I had to then turn to material culture and research in a very different way. It was a kind of experiential research. So I thought about how can I get closer to this guy? So I looked at the things that he did that could possibly still be done. So I took as I said, I exploit my kids. I took my then 10-year-old son and we went to Israel and we herded sheep, because I needed to know, what is it about being a shepherd in your early years that makes it a great entry-level position for being the future CEO of Israel? Because you see it over and over again, Abraham, Moses, they all start out as shepherds, and there's something that they learn from that experience. So we found ourselves on a sun-blasted hillside, separating the sheep from the goats, which is as hard in reality as the metaphor implies. But I realized that the obvious thing that we learned was, if you're going to try and lead, you have to understand those that you're trying to lead, even sheep. So until we understood something basic about the nature of the sheep and the goats, we couldn't separate them. But once we got it, we could. So so understand those that you're trying to lead is one thing. So that was one thing, going through the caves around Ein Gedi, where David hid out from Samuel in the first of his many reversals of fortune. And again, my 10-year-old was a great help, because he was playing the fleet-footed David to my dyspeptic middle-aged soul, trudging after him, never quite catching up to him. And then, we went, Masada was right there, so we scrambled up Masada, and mainly for me to get a look of the lay of the land. But we got there just as a tour group was getting the whole, tragic story of, you know, Masada and the guide is telling about how when he was in the army, you know, they come up there at dawn and they take an oath on their rifle in the Bible, Masada will not fall again. And I'm verklempt, you know, I'm completely carried away by this. And as we're walking back down the hill, my son turns to me and he goes, why was he saying that Masada will not fall again? There's nothing up there. Nobody would want it.
I think for me, I mean, research is just such a great alternative to writing. You know? So every opportunity is gorgeous. When I wrote Away, I ended up going places. I hadn't thought I was going to have to do this, but it's a character who comes to the United States and then goes back to Russia. And so spending time in Russia, and it's a very funny thing because you talked about sort of the light, and it is the same light that was seen before. It's how I felt about the sky in Russia. You know, this sort of extraordinary, what Anna Akhmatova calls the blue enameled sky of Russia. And then I went to Alaska because a lot of the novel takes place there. And I was lucky because I got the flu. And this very nice poet put me up on the 3rd floor of her log cabin and stopped by, sort of said, I have other things to do and I have my day job. And she would sort of like leave me a little bowl of soup and I would just I lay there for 12 days. I was so sick. And I watched the weather change from summer in Alaska to winter in Alaska. And I feel like that was a great opportunity to learn about what I was writing about. And, you know, sometimes for me, the research leads to the story. It doesn't just support the story. Sometimes when I was writing Lucky Us, I have a character, Gus, who's the central male protagonist. And I had been looking for something actually about the bombing of Dresden. And instead, I found myself, which doesn't happen very often, in a particular rabbit hole of the internet, which turned out to be first-person accounts of German Americans and Germans who had lived in America for 20 and 30 years being interned in the United States during World War II, about which I knew nothing. And it changed the novel, because there were 11,000 people in this country interned, and because in the end, Harry Truman felt very strongly that because they were German, as opposed to Japanese, they could easily blend in with the population, and therefore they needed to be kept in camps longer. And so the last person who was released from internment in the United States was a person who had lived in the United States from the age of 2, but had not gotten around to becoming a citizen, and wasn't released until 1947. And so this story of the internment and our deporting people became much more central to the novel. And I hadn't even known, I didn't know I was going to write about this, but it was such an extraordinary story for me. And the story of, it was the first time I had ever seen the word self-deportation, because that was part of our plan, so that we would turn to these people who had already basically had their businesses taken away, who were in sort of fairly nice concentration camps, but nevertheless, that's what they were: barbed wire, dogs, armed guards in the middle of Texas, where nobody, you know, miles of desert all around them. And we basically said, if you'd like to get out before 1947, we can send you back to Germany. And most of these people didn't even speak German. And so, you know, there was this moment of reading this first-person account of somebody as an 11-year-old boy realizing that he and his family had collectively about $25 and were basically left at a railroad station in Germany. So that for me is one of those really wonderful moments where the research actually created a piece of the novel. And as I say, since usually I'm making stuff up right and left, it was a real gift to come across that story.
One more question? Oh.
Is it a different experience for you to create a male character to a female character?
Is it a different experience to create a male character than a female character?
Absolutely, yes. Not a happy occasion doing something in a male voice. It's much more of a struggle for me, I think. So I've done it twice when the story insisted on being told in a male voice, and the first occasion was March, and with March at least I had Bronson Alcott to lean heavily upon. And then Nathan, you know, his being male was only the beginning of the problem there. He's also, you know, from Second Iron Age Israel, and he thinks he hears the voice of God. So there was a lot to grapple with that was unfamiliar with him. And with my female characters, I've found that I tend to hear people that I like to hear, that are easy to hear, and I really like them and I miss them when they're gone. I don't find myself pining over Mr. March or Nathan so much.
Yeah, given Mr. March and Nathan. But I think for me, I don't find it, it's different. And I think maybe if they had come from, you know, as you say, the completely different period in the world, but I hear my male characters' voices as clearly as the female ones. I think maybe if there were, I think of sort of in different books, the sort of central, lots of times there isn't a central male character. My first novel, it's an African-American basketball player who gets injured and goes on to become a businessman. And his voice was certainly as clear to me as the female protagonist. They were, in fact, it's a novel in which there's a central female character and then two central male characters, and they're very different. And those voices have not been that much harder for me. There are ways in which something feels a little more comfortable, you feel like you get a little slip, you can sort of slide more easily sometimes into the female voice, but I don't find them, for me.
I find it very hard to kind of imagine male desire. I really find that a struggle, because I do think it's different. And so that's when I call on my in-house editor to make sure.
Oh, well, I agree with, I think there are occasions where it's great to be able to turn to somebody who is not you, and it's especially handy if they have the experience of being whatever the other is that you're trying to sort of become and express.
And on that somewhat racy note.
Thank you, first of all. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Gail, Geraldine, and Amy.